So what I want to do during this afternoon session, and we try to do it every year, I try to take some time and find an area where I can take you behind the curtain and talk a little bit more about some of the process that I use, or some of the thinking behind some of the choices that we make along the way, help you understand who Mosaic is and how we approach the world. And our theme is the future of, and there cannot be a theme that's more intimately connected to the essence of Mosaic. Because from the very beginning, we have always been about the future. And I was always caught off guard how awkward our relationship with the future has been as followers of Jesus. Because we don't mind the word history, but we're really awkward with the word future. I would hear people say, let's change history. And I would think to myself, it's the only thing you can't change. Because history is history, and you can't change history. And Christians are fine with that, changing history, but we're not okay with creating the future. I think once there was this huge festival in Northern California, 30,000 people who were just celebrating who Jesus was and worshiping, and then I heard the guy in the band said, let's make history, which is a great declaration. But I thought, and everybody cheered, but I thought if he had said, let's create the future, everybody would have said, no, we can't do that. But how do you make history if you do not create the future? In fact, if we cannot create the future, we cannot make history. And so oftentimes we have this superstitious relationship to the future, because we feel like, no, the future is God's and we're not supposed to touch the future. Except I don't know if you notice this, but there are a lot of fingerprints on the future. There are all kinds of people all throughout human history who have shaped the future. And in fact, a lot of times, we don't even like who's shaping the future. And people who believe in Jesus will go and vote because they believe their vote will affect the future. But then they don't live their life as if they're actually affecting the future. So what I want to talk to you about just for a few moments is the future of history. Because we're comfortable with history, but we're not comfortable with the future. But one day, someone's going to be looking back on this moment, and it will be history. And so what I want us to do is to step out of our chairs, and I want us to time travel into the future so that we're comfortable engaging what must be changed. Because if we can just be 100 years from now and look back to this moment, we're going to be okay with tomorrow. It's only when it's tomorrow there's a problem. When it's yesterday, we're good. But there is a future of history, because history is created in a very unique and powerful way. And in fact, there's this passage I want to share with you, and I know you're familiar with it, but it's a passage that's usually only read when someone dies. It's kind of odd how there are certain passages of scriptures that we only use at weddings, or certain ones we only use at funerals. And so I want us to hear this passage in a very different context. It's in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And begin in verse 1. Solomon writes these words: there is a time for everything, a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What do workers gain from all their toil? I have seen the burden that God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Solomon is struggling with the tension of time and eternity. That somehow we are creatures bound in time and space, and yet somehow connected to that which is timeless and eternal. And a huge part of our human struggle, a part of our own crisis of life, is that we're never really comfortable completely inside of time. Because if we were comfortable inside of time, we would not fear death. But we're not quite comfortable in this space of time and space. Have you ever been claustrophobic? I do not like being in enclosed spaces. In fact, it was just a few days ago, I was in an elevator, and it did not work for the first few minutes. It might have been here at the Ace Hotel. And I felt it. I felt it, that moment where I saw the oxygen in the room leaving. You don't think I saw it, but I did. I could feel the walls closing in. It happened so fast. I don't know if it was stuck. It might have just been slow. But it was slow enough to make me feel stuck, and I was trapped in this moment. See, I think all of us as humans have this sense of feeling claustrophobic inside of time and space. And there's this unexplainable relationship where it says that there's a time for everything, and then he culminates by saying, but God has also set eternity in the human heart. So here we are, we're time-dated and eternal at the same time. I don't even understand the complexity of it, but my understanding of reality has changed. Because there was a time where we saw matter and energy as different things. And so we knew that there was energy, electricity, that would light these lights and give us the power in this room. But then there's matter and material that are things we can touch and feel. And now we understand that that was an illusion. What we once thought was reality wasn't ever real. Reality didn't change. Our understanding of reality changed. Now we understand that everything is energy. Isn't it insane? Now what's crazy is that the superstition seems more real than the reality. See, if I were going to give you two options of reality, one is that there's a difference between energy and matter, that what we can touch here is of a different composition than what we can see flying through the sky on a thunderous night. Or if I said, no, they're all the same, it's just energy traveling at different speeds, which one would seem more likely to you? You're out of your mind. So my understanding as a novice is that this stool is just energy slowing down and materializing. And that if it were not complicated enough that you and me are of the same material, which helps me then understand God. Because it's difficult to understand God, especially when you deal with time. How can a God who's eternal stand in the middle of time? How does that happen? See, I've come to understand God as the one who is light. And he moves faster than time. He's timeless. But God created us inside of time. And so when God stepped into human history in the person of Jesus, when God took on flesh and blood, it was God slowing down to our speed so that he could walk with us. You see, energy is everywhere. It's only the energy that slows down and materializes that we're aware of. You ever touch someone and you shock them? I'm electrifying. I've got that static thing happening all the time. And that energy was always there, but sometimes it activates. My nickname when I travel the world is Random Search. And I think I was in London, and I went through the machine, and it turned on again, as it almost does every single time I travel across the world. And I finally said, hey, is this really a random search? Or is it this? I know, I look like a criminal. I've seen my photos. I understand. I would pick me too. But It would just help me if you would just tell me that machine has a button, you hit it, and then it goes off. You go, I'm sorry, sir, you've been randomly selected to be searched again. And the security agent in London said, no, you see, you have to understand, these machines are set at a certain frequency, and if you happen to have a high level of frequency electronically in your body, you might set it off all the time. Yeah, that's me. I'm electric. I know this sounds almost like fiction, but you can ask him. About 30 years ago, my mom bought me a watch for my birthday, and it broke within weeks. And I took it to get it repaired, and they said there's nothing wrong with it. It was working when they gave it back to me, and then I wore it for a few days, it broke again. I took it back, and they checked the battery, said the battery's new, and then I took it back, and it broke again. I was so angry because they couldn't fix the watch. And then I realized that the watch would only break when I was wearing it. And then when I put it on the shelf for a day or two, it would start working again. And then I started researching, and I found there's this phenomenon that some people let out such strong electrical currents that they actually stop watches. So I began to become a watch collector because I realized that I could have different watches. They would stop after a few days, and then I could leave them alone. They would start working again. I would wear another one, and they would stop. And I know this sounds insane, but I'm just telling you, you see, you are electrical. You are light, slowing down into time, touching eternity. And when God's Spirit moves in history, I see the Spirit of God as God speeding up and slowing down and grabbing us and speeding up, pulling us forward and slowing down. And the Spirit of God is God who is faster than time, slowing into time, moving with us. You want to know what the future of history is? It is written by those who are time travelers. See, we have an unfair advantage. We are not trapped in time. We are eternal. And God has not only set eternity in our hearts, but the scriptures tell us that if you are in relationship to Jesus, you are already seated at the right hand of God. You're already seated in the heavenlies with Christ. It doesn't say one day you're going to be seated with Jesus, it's saying right now. I don't know if you know this, but you have multiple residencies right now. You are here in this moment, but you are transcendent. You are not trapped in time. You are connected to eternity. Have you ever wished like you could go through a portal? Or is that just me? Go through a portal into a different dimension? Go through a portal into a different time? Go through a portal to a different reality? I have extraordinary news for you. You may never go through a portal other than Jesus. Because Jesus is the portal. In fact, that's what he says. We just don't have the right translation. Because when he says, I am the door, I am the gate, what Jesus is saying, I'm the portal. And you're in a dimension that God would call death and existence. And when you go through the portal, you enter into a new dimension that's called life. But even more than that, you now become a portal. And eternity is ushered into time through you. So he says, he has set eternity in the hearts of every human being. History, if I could just reduce it to something simple, is the interweaving of two stories. And it can look like it's interweaving of time and eternity, but it's more tactile than that because it has a more visceral effect on us. History is the weaving of two stories. It's the story of beauty and the story of tragedy. And it's interesting that Solomon, when he lists all the different seasons, all the different times, he says, but God has made everything beautiful in its time. But let's be really honest, everything isn't beautiful, is it? In fact, there's so much violence, and so much pain, and so much brokenness, and so much suffering in the world. And it seems justified when a person says, I can't believe in God because there's so much suffering in the world. See, and if we're not time travelers writing the story of God in human history. That's all people will see. I cannot believe in God because there's so much suffering in the world. But there are two stories in human history, and one's the story of tragedy, and by the way, we are the authors of that story. We are the progenitors, the creators of the story of human tragedy. God created the story of beauty. So he created us to live in a beautiful story. But we crashed into God's story. We became uninvited ghostwriters, changing the plot. And so now you have two stories weaving together, the story of God, all the beauty that's there, and the story of us, all the tragedy that's there. When a person says, I cannot believe in God because there's so much suffering in the world, it's because we have not adequately written the story of God so they could be overwhelmed by all the beauty in the world. See, I'm on the other end of the spectrum. I'm like, there's so much beauty in the world, I can't help but believe in God. But that beauty is set in time at just the right time. And so we have to pay attention to the time we're in. See, I think sometimes we're not paying attention that we're time travelers entering into other people's history. And so there are moments in time where, and by the way, there's a time for everything, for every activity under the sun, a time to be born and a time to die. It would be so awkward for you to act as if someone just died when someone was just born. Like, hey, do you know what's going on here? We're celebrating life. I actually thought that was such a nuanced moment when we had that beautiful compassion video. I was feeling brokenhearted. The keys played what I was feeling. I was like so sad for all these kids. Anybody else? And then Aaron goes, change the music up. This is a moment of celebration. See, we were looking backwards at the problem, and Aaron was looking forward at the solution. But our problem is that we want to be so cool and so relevant to the world that all we talk about is all the tragedy. See, for art to exist, there can be any human emotion. Art can emerge out of pain. Art can emerge out of despair. Art can emerge out of violence. Art can emerge out of anger. But for beauty to exist, there has to be hope. There has to be love. There has to be faith. That's why the greatest artists in the world, from Picasso to Van Gogh to Monet to Jesus of Nazareth, all agree with the same thing, that all great art is inspired by love. Even the ones that had a hard time loving. Picasso had a hard time loving anyone but himself. Van Gogh was so confused about love, he cut off his ear. He should have just cut off the girl and keep the ear. In fact, it seems that almost every artist is so confused by love that they're tormented by it, but never stop searching for it. Is it possible that our role in human history is to be the future of history? Because whenever the story ends at despair, there's no future in despair. See, whenever the story ends at violence, there's no future in violence. Whenever the story ends in hopelessness, there's no future there. Whenever a story ends with bitterness and unforgiveness, there's no future there. And some of you have had relationships in your life that have no future because they ended with unforgiveness. They ended with anger. They ended with violence. They ended with hopelessness. See, whenever a story has one more page, it's because there's hope waiting for you. There's beauty waiting for you. There's forgiveness waiting for you. That's why with Jesus, there's always a future and a hope. It's fascinating to me the way we dissect truth. We hear the words of God. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, as he spoke through Jeremiah. Plans of welfare, not calamity or destruction. with a future and a hope. And so we get it. We go, you see, without God, there's no hope. We would all say that. See, without God, there's no hope. Without Jesus, there's no hope. But then we go, yeah, but everyone has a future. But if everyone has a future without God, then everyone has hope without God, because they were put together. See, I will give you a future and hope. See, the reality is that we think we have a future without God, but there is no future being created if God is not a part of it. See, God doesn't just give you hope, He gives you a future. He's saying you will never be trapped in your worst moment. You will never be trapped in the fears of your past. You will never be trapped from having the life you long for if I'm still writing the story in your life. So I want us to learn how to write history by making history, by creating the future, but not just for us. Because the moment you step into someone else's time, there's a time for everything. And that moment when that person feels it's time to weep, then you weep with them. It's time to laugh, you laugh with them. When it's time to embrace, you embrace them. When it's time to refrain from embracing, you refrain. When there's a time to search, you search with them. When it's a time to give up, you give up with them, but you do it with them. Because if you're not in their story, then all they have is the story of tragedy. And they may never know the story of beauty in the midst of the tragedy. See, a part of our conviction in our community is that we're all time travelers, but we have been disconnected from the trap of time into eternity, and now we're ushering eternity into time. And we get to be a part of that with other people, which is such a beautiful, beautiful thing. I think one of the reasons it's so hard to translate sometimes what we understand about our faith journey, what it means to be a person connected to Jesus, to be a spiritual creature, is that we actually have a conviction that everything that looks like it's temporary is actually all connected to the eternal, and that we're supposed to bring the eternal value into every moment in time. How do you take a moment in time and make it eternal? You make sure that you are always intimately connected to the presence of the God who is outside of time. And then you become a portal of the presence of God to the world around you. See, I don't want to give you a strategy for how to be more spiritual, or a strategy for how to be a more effective leader. I want to challenge you to actually begin to be something unexplainable in the material world. Because you keep thinking yourself in such a way that you're nothing more than a highly complex stool, rather than the image of God slowed down into time. You are designed to move at light speed. And I started thinking about my own journey of faith. Because what God is saying is that He's doing things in human history that we may not be able to see, but we're the ones who are supposed to translate this. I always think it's interesting. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, it says, "These are the things God has revealed to us by His Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God." And then he goes on to say, "For who knows a person's thoughts except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God." So if you just stop there, you just feel hopeless. What he's saying is, who can understand God? That's exactly what Solomon is saying. He says, "I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race." Did you know God placed a burden on the human race? You know what the burden is? He made you eternal and put you in time. It's a burden to bear. Because every other species on this planet is unaware of the eternal, so they can just enjoy the moment. But when your moment costs you your eternity, you feel the emptiness of it. And every moment your soul longs for the eternal. So he says, God has placed his burden on us. We don't understand what he's doing, but he's made everything beautiful in its time, but the time doesn't seem to work out for us. We can't seem to make sense of it. And here it is. And he said eternity in every human heart. Then he goes on, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. In other words, how in the world are we supposed to celebrate what God's doing if we cannot understand what God's doing? And then Paul says the same thing. In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. How does that help us? Oh, there is a way. Just a few verses later, in verse 16, he says, oh, for who has known the mind of the Lord as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. And so what Paul is saying is no one understands what God is doing except the Spirit of God. Oh, and by the way, now that you're in relationship to Jesus, you have the Spirit of God. And now that you have the Spirit of God, you have the mind of Christ. And guess who can know what's on God's mind? You. And once you have the mind of God, once you have the mind of Christ, it's not that you know everything or understand everything. See, I think we've misunderstood God because we've been more affected by the Enlightenment than we have by the Scriptures. So when we think about having the mind of Christ, we think, oh, I'm going to know everything. I'm going to get everything right. I'm going to have all the right information. You keep thinking God's an accountant. God is an artist. When you have the mind of Christ, you are now able to see beauty in the midst of tragedy. You are now able to see hope in the midst of despair. You're now able to see love in the midst of hate and forgiveness in the midst of bitterness. You now see through the eyes of God, and there is no tragedy in which you cannot see beauty and wonder. There is no moment in which you do not see a future. As I was reading this years ago, it occurred to me, if God makes everything beautiful in its time, and God is the source of beauty, then how is it that we're not all just drawn to God's beauty? In fact, in Isaiah, it tells us that when Jesus would walk the earth, that we would see nothing beautiful in him, that we would find nothing attractive about him. I thought, how strange. Is it possible to actually think that hideous things are beautiful and beautiful things are hideous? Are we predisposed to that as humans? And then I started thinking about my early experiences with like steak. I'm from El Salvador. All Latinos burn their steak because we never get good meat. We have to kill all the parasites and all the bacteria. And so just as a culture, we burn everything. So we think charcoal is a food group. And I was just a young guy in Miami. I was probably 13, 14 years old. I got a job in a steak restaurant because we couldn't afford to eat steak at home. So I got a job in a steak restaurant so they could pay me in meat. It was my strategy to eat. And I remember when I ordered my first steak as an employee, they asked me how I wanted to cook. I said, well done, which I thought was a beautiful statement. Well done. Isn't that what Jesus said? Well done. And then when it came time for me to eat, my food never came. And I said, where's my food? And they said, the chef refuses to burn your steak. Oh. I said, what? It's my steak. I can have it any way I want. They said, I'm sorry, but the chef is not going to burn your steak. I said, tell him I want my steak well done. The chef left the kitchen, came back to where all of us were working, all the busboys, and he said, where is the man who wants to burn my meat? I wasn't a man. I was just a boy. I didn't know. He said, I refuse to burn my meat. I said, I just want my steak cooked really well. He goes, I'll make you a deal. I'll make you steak my way, medium rare. And if you don't like it, I'll burn you another steak. And I thought, 2 steaks, that works for me. I can take the other one home, cook it later. So they brought me back the steak, and it was bleeding into my baked potato. That steak was not nearly dead. It was nearly alive. And I thought to myself, I'll just be polite. I'll wait a minute when he leaves. I'm just going to box it and take it home. And he would not leave. He just stood there. I said, well, what are you doing? He goes, taste. So I cut into that steak, and it didn't even cut right. It cut like butter. It was weird. I want steak that fights for its life. And it was like, but it just cuts so easily. And it was a little, texture was wrong. And he just stood there and it was bleeding, just drops of blood. And I put that steak in my mouth and I met God. And I had never known. I didn't know what a steak could taste like. I didn't know. See, I had trained my taste buds to love the hideous and to despise the beautiful. And it took someone who refused to let me accept a life that is less, who refused to let me believe this was the best experience a human being could ever have. And he forced me to take that first taste. And I'm grateful ever since. Now I want my steak to have memory. I want my food. So raw, I said, just go raw. Keep going raw. It's the same with coffee. You know that's true. I mean, you're around coffee snobs. My wife thinks I'm a coffee snob, but I'm not. And I just appreciate great coffee. Now my children are coffee snobs, and they do it without shame. But you see, when we started, I loved Starbucks. Kim still loves Starbucks. Some people you just leave in the past. I'm just kidding, honey. I love Starbucks. I even wrote in Soul Cravings about how much I love Starbucks. I've traveled the world looking for, I would go, oh, there's a Starbucks. Kim go, honey, you don't have to identify every Starbucks in the world. I go, there's one. Look, there's another Starbucks. I was drawn to all the Starbucks. You know why? Because I'm older than everyone else. So I grew up with really bad coffee, like Folgers, Sanka. You just pour it in the hot water, swirl the spoon, and that's coffee. And so when Starbucks came into existence, it didn't taste right. And I remember the first time I walked into a Starbucks and I said, oh, this is terrible. I can't. And they said, no. The guy said, you're used to swill. You have to retrain your taste buds. And I actually think a lot of people, all the bougie now, like elitist coffee snobs, they were transitioned by Starbucks. Starbucks was the midwife. Suddenly people realized, oh, wow, there's another experience. And then all of a sudden, all these boutique coffee shops started opening up going, it gets better than this, and it gets better than this, and it gets better than this, and it gets better than this. By the way, a lot of people think they've already tried and experienced everything Jesus has to offer. And it's because all they've tasted is swill. Because if we're just expressing religion and we're not alive in a dynamic faith, we've betrayed them. Because they did not taste how good the Lord is. And see, a part of what we're supposed to do is reclaim the story of beauty. And when they saw Jesus, they said nothing beautiful in him. He was so unattractive to them. You know why? Because we thought humans looked a certain way. When Jesus stepped onto the stage, he didn't look like us. And we keep attributing to Jesus things because he's fully God, but actually the things that astonish us the most are the things that actually reflect him being fully man. See, I think what would really, really paralyze us is if we realize that the things that we should be aspiring to are not the things that make Jesus fully God. We should be aspiring to things that make Jesus fully man. Because the full humanity of Jesus is the promise of us. And by the way, if there's just two stories, the story of beauty and the story of tragedy, and they're being interwoven, it would make sense that there was a crash course, a crash collision taking place. And isn't it odd that the cross is the most tragic moment in human history? And it is the most beautiful moment in the human future. The cross is the intersection that says humanity's tragic past can be left behind for humanity's most beautiful future. So I couldn't help but reflect back. And I came to faith the week I turned 20 years old. I didn't know anything about Jesus. I didn't know anything about the Bible. I didn't know anything about anything. And I'd never seen a Bible, and some guy gave me a King James Bible, and I'd never read Shakespeare, so it was really complicated. And I came to faith, and then I was baptized the next week, and then I took a Greyhound bus back to college. So I didn't have anyone to give me a lot of time and investment. They gave me the basics. They said, here's a Bible, read it every day, pray every day, tell people about Jesus every day, talk to God, listen. Oh, go to church. And that was basically it. So I went back to college, and I'm brand new. I mean, I've been a follower of Jesus 8 days. I got a call from a nun. I still remember her name, Sister Marge Paulus. Now, I went to the Catholic church one time that I can remember, because my roommate was Catholic, and he said, come with me to church. I didn't want to go, but he was so insistent. I went to the Catholic church, and Sister Marge met me at the door. I don't know why. And she looked at me, she goes, I'd like you to do the scripture reading today. Who does that? Who picks a complete stranger walking into a Catholic church and says, you're going to do the scripture reading today? And I looked at that nun, and I said, get that book away from me. I don't want to touch it. Because I didn't know if there was a God, but I figured if I touched it, he'd kill me right that moment. I was like, no, not you. And so I'm not going to touch it. That's my one experience with that nun. I go home for the summer to see my mom. I had this life-changing encounter with Jesus. I go back to college, and this nun calls me up, and we meet at this hamburger, Carl's Jr. And I'm meeting this nun. You got to know it's a cool nun when she's meeting you at a Carl's Jr., right? You know, and so we're sitting down, and she goes, we're going to have this interdenominational ecumenical council for the next 3 months, and all these churches are coming together to meet together, and I want you to be in charge of the spiritual aspect of every one of these meetings for the next 3 months. I'm the guy that wouldn't touch the Bible. I'm thinking, this is the problem with the Catholic Church. You're trusting people like me. There's something wrong with you. And I looked at her and I said, Sister Marge, I don't know why you would think I would do that. Because I'm the guy that wouldn't touch the Bible. She goes, no, I remember you. I said, okay, well, it's worse than that. I now have a relationship with Jesus, and I was baptized in a Baptist church, which is worse. And she said to me, God spoke to me in a dream and told me he was going to change your life, and that I was supposed to put you in charge. This is about 10 days after I experienced Jesus in my life. And so what became normal for me was that God moves through dreams and visions. And what was crazy is I started looking at the scriptures, and you know when the scriptures tell us, and it was so important to God that he gave to Joel in the Old Testament, so important to God that he made sure that Peter preached it in the New Testament, and so important to God he made sure that Luke wrote it down in the book of Acts. He said that the movement of Jesus, in this movement, your young men will have visions and your old men will dream dreams. And I always saw that, okay, so that's what happens once you come to know Jesus. But I began looking at the book of Acts, and I realized it's not that. See, because just a few chapters later, Peter is having a vision, because God's trying to get him to go to Cornelius because he doesn't want to go to the Gentiles. But that's not all that's happening. Cornelius, this guy who doesn't know Jesus yet, is having a vision of Peter. And actually, God is giving both the person who believes and the person who doesn't believe visions that would actually collide. They were both already coming to know each other inside of their imaginations. They were traveling to meet each other in the invisible before they met each other in the visible. See, I think there's a future of spirituality. See, the future of spirituality is not the ritual and routines, the patterns and disciplines of your faith. It is the ability to be in the middle of the history God is writing and the future God is creating, and being the instrument of God to bring beauty into the tragedy of the human story. And we travel from dreams to dreams and visions to visions. So I became a follower of Jesus, and I got involved really fast, and I went to everything. I went to the Pentecostal Bible study, the Methodist Bible study, the Baptist Bible study, the Church of Christ Bible study, and the Roman Catholic Mass. Everything. And the interdenominational stuff and the Campus Crusade thing. Every day of the week, I was just going to something. And then there's one group, and there was a girl who was the worship leader, and I used to borrow her guitar, and I would start learning how to sing songs and write music. And one day this girl, Lynn, came up to me and said, hey, you don't know about my past, but I used to live with my boyfriend, Kennedy, and you know, we were kind of like wild, and it was a different kind of life. Alcohol, drugs. She goes, I called my boyfriend. He's coming back to get me. I'm leaving college. I just don't feel God anymore, and I'm leaving. I was shocked. I didn't know anyone could believe in Jesus and walk away. I didn't know how that could happen. I mean, how could you ever stop looking at something so beautiful? How would you ever want to step out of such beauty and wonder? But she did. And I didn't know what to say to her because I hadn't read very much of the Bible. I hadn't taken any courses. I didn't know how to counsel anybody. I didn't know all the right answers. So I just looked at her frustrated. I said, if there's anything God could do for you to prove his love for you, I know he would do it. You ever said something stupid like that? I mean, now I know I should have said Jesus died on the cross and there was his proof that he loves you. He doesn't need to do anything else to prove it. But I didn't think of that. So I just know if anything that he could do to prove his love for you, he would do it. And this girl just looked at me and said, well, then I want it to snow. And that's why I never really understood women when I was dating. And because like, who says that? It was like a prepared response in case God ever asks, this is my request. She didn't even hesitate. And I looked at her, and I don't know why I said this, but I looked at her and I said, God's going to make it snow. And I heard myself say it. And then I meant to say, but he needs more than 24 hours. But I was so shocked at what I said that I said within 24 hours. So now I said something impossible that I have no control over, and I gave myself a time limit. And I was so paralyzed by myself that I left. And I went to my room, and I closed the door, and I turned off the lights, and I pulled down the shades, and I fell on my face, and I started praying, saying, God, was that you? God, did you tell me to say that? If it wasn't you, could you just pick it up as your idea? Because it's a good one. It would be really epic. And I remember just praying and praying. And because I was brand new, I didn't know how God worked. And so I was praying and I fell asleep. I count unconscious intercession. And I fell asleep for hours. And my roommate later just comes in the room, opens the door, and I could tell he knew. See, this girl, she went and told everyone she saw on the university campus, God's going to make it snow for me because he loves me. God's going to make it snow for me because he loves me. God's going to make it snow for me because he loves me. I wish I'd read the Gospel of Mark before the Gospel of John, because in Mark, Jesus says, go and tell no one. And I could have acted really spiritual and been like, Jesus, go and tell no one. But I didn't think of that, because what fool would go tell everyone that? And she did. And my roommate looked at me, he goes, Erwin. I jumped up, I woke up, stopped praying. And he said, have you looked outside? I thought he was mocking me. I said, oh, he knows. And I remember getting up slowly, walking over the window, pulling up the shade, and there was snow everywhere. And there was no projection of snow, no prediction of snow. It started snowing almost the second I walked into my room and fell on my knees. I didn't know it had been snowing and snowing and snowing every second I was praying. And then here's the dilemma. Then I went to seminary. And they told me, God doesn't work like that anymore. And I said, it's too late. See, I'm convinced that we keep looking for the wrong thing. We keep looking for better strategies and better systems and better programs. And I just think we're supposed to be fully alive. That we're supposed to be the people of dreams and visions. We're supposed to be the writers of human history. We're the time travelers. We can step out of time into eternity, grab all that eternity has and bring it back into time. We are connected to the transcendent. We are light in the midst of darkness. We bring the future into people who are trapped in their past. I hope you never come here to Mosaic just to get ideas. See, I want you to be so overwhelmed by the reality of who Jesus is. I want you to walk out of these doors and know that God's presence is invading every space that you step into. I want everyone who steps into your space to feel some shaking in the universe. Because if matter is energy and I just don't have the capacity to translate that reality, so my experience lies to me, it's not the truth. There's a deeper, more profound reality. I know you feel like you're just flesh and blood. I know you feel like you're just trapped inside of time and space. I'm telling you, that's not the real. The real is that you are spirit. You are connected to the eternal God. The God who created the entire universe dwells within you. And every time you enter the room, you have an unfair advantage because God is with us. I hope you get inspired to innovate. I hope you become inspired to create. I hope you find some nuggets that allow you to see your own world just a little differently. But more than everything, more than anything, I hope that you step into who you are. You are a portal into eternity. God ushers his story of beauty and wonder and hope and love and faith into the human story. So don't let everyone who has not yet found God write the story of us. Get out your pen and start writing the story of you.